welcome you to Mercer's presentation along with the Business Council of Westchester on the evolving DEI landscape, successfully navigating it. My name is Marcia Gordon, and I'm President and CEO of the Business Council of Westchester. And Mercer, as I said, is a partner of the BCW and the sponsor of today's event. Mercer brings strategic expertise to all things HR related, from health and benefits brokerage and program strategy to workforce planning and HR transformation to retirement and investment services. They offer thought leadership and consulting services that address all areas of the human resource function. Mercer is part of the Marsh McLennan family of companies, which includes Marsh, Guy Carpenter, and Oliver Wyman. Together, they serve customers in the areas of risk and reinsurance, business consulting, and human resource strategy. Thank you, Mercer, for all you do. We welcome you as a new BCW member and partner, and we look forward to a series of webinars with you this year. And we have two fabulous people presenting today, and I'm pleased to introduce them. Angela Berg is partner and global diversity and inclusion consulting leader for Mercer. She's passionate about helping global organizations successfully support the diversity, inclusion, and well-being of their employees. In her 20-year tenure at Mercer, Angela has partnered with some of the firm's largest clients and also smaller clients, I've just learned, across a broad range of industries, including tech, pharma, manufacturing, and media and entertainment, to leverage data, analytics, and research to develop effective D&I strategies and help organizations deliver the optimal mix of programs, policies, and processes to facilitate senior leadership alignment and commitment, to develop comprehensive change strategies for complex and diverse organizations with multiple stakeholders, and to create D&I communication strategies and campaigns aligned to the organization's mission, values, and culture. Welcome, Angela. And I'm pleased to also introduce Bill Rubridge, the senior partner of Mercer. I hope I got it right the second time, Bill.
That's good, thank you.
30 plus years of experience in workforce communications, engagement, and culture development and change. Bill's recent diversity, equity, and inclusion work includes culture change communications to promote DEI and raise awareness of the impact of unconscious bias, reviewing HR policy, benefits, recruiting, training, and organizational culture documents to identify gaps and improvement opportunities for DEI, and coordinating the communication and execution of the Intercultural Development Inventory, IDI, for senior leadership and HR business partnerships for a global manufacturer. Both Angela and Bill have indicated that they welcome questions during the presentation. I am very much looking forward to this presentation. And with that, I turn it over to Angela and Bill. And again, thank Mercer for your partnership.
Great. Marcia, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I just want to say that Bill and I are delighted to be here today to talk about what's happening in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as Marcia said, we definitely welcome questions as we go along. We'll try to take as many as we go and save some time at the end to go over the rest. And also, I'm in Seattle today, but I have visited Westchester County many times. So again, delighted to be here with everyone this morning. So today we're going to talk about what's happening in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are the things that as employers you should be potentially focusing on for your organization and for your employees, for your stakeholders, and what are some of the practical things that organizations can do to really advance your agenda in this space? So let's start out with a question that we get all the time, which is D&I just kind of the flavor of the day? Is it something that HR organizations really need to pay attention to and make changes to address? And given the constant topic of this in the headlines, as well as what we're seeing in our own society, you know, it's a good question. And I'll say the answer to that is yes. And why is that? I think that if you look back over the past several years, in fact, there have been a number of macro forces happening in this country and globally that are really driving the agenda around DEI and the need for organizations to take it seriously and create a strategy around it. You know, the pandemic COVID-19, and this is, you know, well documented in the news every day, has had a disproportionate impact on women's careers in terms of staying home with children, as well as disproportionate health impacts on certain people of color, you know, the Hispanic, Latinx population, as well as Black and African American population in this country. So there's definitely workforce DEI impacts of the pandemic as organizations start to recover and think about what their workforce looks like moving forward. The other piece that I really want to focus on today is expectations around purpose and social responsibility from different multiple kinds of stakeholders. Over to the right, we have a quote from Larry Fink, and we know that about 1/3 to 40% of organizations in the US are now really starting to think about their business models as multi-stakeholder in this multi-stakeholder environment, and who are those stakeholders that are pressing for change. One of the things that I often talk to my clients about is the fact that the younger generations, particularly the millennials, the younger ones in particular, and Gen Z, as they are coming into the workforce, they have a very different set of expectations and actually demands for the employers that they work with. There's a lot of data and research out there, some of which Mercer's done, that shows that this particular demographic wants to work for companies who are very authentic and progressive around diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as other things like sustainability, purpose, and that moving forward, organizations who are able to you know, demonstrate that they've made progress in this area will be an employer of choice for this younger demographic. If you already have a large number of these employees, you may have already received feedback from them and you know, commentary. I think of them as kind of an activist generation in the workforce that's really demanding change. So, and not to mention stakeholder pressures of stakeholders, customers, consumers who want to do business with companies who are doing the right thing. So all of these pressures together, again, kind of to summarize, the answer is yes. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that employers who want to be relevant, who want to be employers of choice in the future, do need to address. So what does that require to be successful around diversity, equity, and inclusion? So a couple perspectives I want to share here. First of all, a question we also get is, you know, we're familiar with DEI, we know what diversity and inclusion means, but when did the E show up? What does equity mean? How do we address that? And one of the things that Mercer does is a lot of analytics, and we look at a lot of data from organizations that we work with. We've been doing global research in this space for many years. And the reality is that in different ways, we see that there is inequity in the workplace and that certain groups do not enjoy the same equality of opportunity, experience, and pay as others. And the concept of equity is to basically write that, to ensure that everyone does have an opportunity to participate and enjoy the rewards of an organization, the culture of an organization in an equal way. So it's really focused on taking action, being strategic, and doing the right thing to drive change. As it relates to that, another comment that I want to make is that when we kind of look at the broad trajectory of DEI in this country and globally over the past 20 years or so, it's been a focus on gender primarily. And right now there's a focus on race and ethnicity. And just want to call out that we always challenge organizations to think about how do you solve this for everyone? How do you create that equality of opportunity, experience, and pay for all the different employees in your organization who have different dimensions of diversity, and some multiple, they're an intersectional lens on that. And also, you know, to just address the elephant in the room, also ensure that white men have equality of opportunity, experience, and pay as the organization continues to evolve and change. And so thinking ahead about what strategies look like, there's typically a need to create equity, special targeted programs for certain groups, but broadly also thinking about how do you just hardwire your organization to really provide that for everyone. So one of the big focal points right now, diversity, equity, inclusion, kind of taking a step back, and one of the things that we wanted to address today is how do you make your organization more diverse? So what I've got here is some research that we did in late 2019. It was global research, but in the United States, we were able to collect workforce demographic information from 100 of our survey participants to take a look at what is the diversity of the organizations. And this is that aggregated results data. And, you know, it's pretty quickly clear what the insider headline from this is, and that is that the BIPOC population, so that's looking at race and ethnicity, is underrepresented in organizations in the United States, at least in our sample set, and we find this to generally be true with most organizations we work with, underrepresented in comparison to the general US population. And as you can see that as we look at higher at leadership levels in the organization, that representation becomes even less. So that's probably, you know, not a huge surprise to anyone here. But what I do want to say is that when companies look at their own data that's similar to this, the automatic reaction is we need to hire more people of color, or if they're looking at other demographics, we need to hire more women, we need to hire more veterans, we need to hire more people with disabilities, and so on. And certainly talent acquisition and hiring is a very key part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. But you know, there's a saying that you can't hire your way to diversity. So let's talk about what that means. Again, Mercer does a lot of data, looks at a lot of organizations and the talent flows, how employees come into the organization, get promoted, and leave. And one of the truths that we've discovered is that organizations that just solely focus on recruiting over time really don't make any gains in their representation of diverse employees. And that's because it's a three-part equation. To increase diversity, you really need to focus on recruiting, hiring, promotion, and retention. And very often we see that employers are doing an okay job on recruiting, some a good job. But unfortunately, once that diverse talent gets into the organization, they are not thriving, their careers are not resulting in promotion, and they're not staying. So there's a retention issue, and it kind of results in a revolving door. So as you're thinking about your own DEI strategy, great, definitely focus on recruiting, but also really ensure that once those folks are hired, that they're going to stay, their careers are going to be successful, and they're going to thrive. And on this slide, you see, you know, some of the areas that from a kind of a practical perspective that we recommend looking at in terms of promotion, looking at your data to say, hey, are diverse talent getting promoted? Is there barriers? Are there points in the organization where they're not advancing beyond that? And why is that? Do we have an adequate pipeline of diverse talent? There's often in today's landscape around DEI, you know, a strong push to hire externally as positions become open to increase diversity, which is fine, but there's also in many cases, a lack of looking down into your own organization and saying, you know, could we be doing a better job building our diverse pipeline? Is there talent that we've somehow overlooked? And usually the answer is yes. One of the areas that I find really intriguing right now is from my manufacturing clients, working with several of them. And we often see that there's a lack of diversity in the sales organization. That's, you know, pretty typical in the US across any kind of industry or company. And one of the things that we hear is we need people who know our business. And then you look down into kind of their production area those people know the business. There's a lot of people who know the business. Some of them are, you have very high potential for other roles in the organization. And in most of the clients we work with, that is the most diverse level of the organization, at least as it relates to race and ethnicity. Progressive organizations are looking there to say, is there talent we can develop there and put into, groom to be in some of these key roles instead of looking externally. So I think some really important opportunities there. And then finally on retention, just ensuring that, the organization is inclusive and that the right kinds of programs are offered to really ensure that diverse talent stays. So again, I want to increase diversity, three-part equation to do so. All right, so let's move on and talk about other kinds of actions that can have the most impact as you're thinking about your DEI strategy. As I mentioned earlier, that our view is that you need to hardwire your culture with the right programs, policies, and processes to really ensure that the right things are happening. And where we typically see the most opportunities for that, probably no surprise, are around the broad talent management space, hiring people, onboarding them, very important, as well as things like performance management. I'll just say that one of the really interesting pieces of work that our colleagues in our data analytics team have been doing over the past year is taking a very wide body of data in the US, aggregated data from de-identified aggregated data from our clients to look at trends in performance management. When you think about all the things that an employee's rating impact, not just their pay, but also promotional opportunities, opportunities to be assigned to certain kinds of projects, leadership roles, supervisor roles, as well as even retention. Clearly, ratings are critically important in any organization. And what our colleagues in our data analytics team have found is that really agnostic of industry, part of the country, size of the organization, there's evidence of trends, very clear trends of bias in performance ratings, where sort of like all things equal, certain segments of populations are routinely getting lower ratings than others. And it's definitely something that we're suggesting that organizations look at to find out is it happening in your organization? And if so, get to the root cause of that and really address it. That's kind of that hardwiring piece to assure the opportunity of experience and pay. And as I mentioned earlier, the most successful DEI strategies really think about how do we create this very this successful workforce environment for all the different employees, and looking at gender, age, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ+, veteran, socioeconomic status, et cetera, as you are developing that strategy, and really thinking about what are specific programs. This is where that concept of the equity boost comes in. What are some specific programs that we can do for some where there's an opportunity to really kind of bring them to the level that others are at? Just to give you some examples that are top of mind for us right now and with our clients, one is around gender. And a lot of organizations that we're working with, including our own, are going to have kind of a hybrid model returning to work post-COVID, where some people will be working from home still. That'll be part of the employee value proposition, and others will be in the office. One of the concerns that we have based on data that we did pre-COVID, we know that employees historically who work from home were not as valued as those who were in the office. They did not have the same promotional opportunities, work opportunities. There's just plenty of data that showed that for most companies as it relates to gender, because there's, probably likelihood that a lot of women may take advantage of that because of their role as caregivers, and that extra flexibility is very helpful. Will they have the same kind of opportunities as those who stay, go back to work in the office? What kinds of things can be done within the organization to assure a little bit more equality there? So that's one example of some things that can be done. And for each of these, there are different considerations of targeted actions that can really help drive that DEI agenda. So I just want to, briefly go over what we call actions that have good intent, but lower impact. And again, there's so much goodwill, so much energy right now, commitment around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many organizations want to do something, take some kind of action, demonstrate their commitment and really make progress. And these, what you see on this slide, are some of the actions that we often see companies take. And, again, these all have good intent, but some limited impact. So I'm going to go over a couple of these. One of them is communicating proactively without a plan. I have a lot of companies who were very passionate about making statements after the death of George Floyd, and and then said, wait a minute, we made a statement, we feel good about that, but we don't know what we're going to do next. And our employees are watching and have expectations. We need to do something. There are many opportunities for companies to communicate and make statements. Certainly what's going on in this country right now with our Asian community and much of the violence and harassment that they've been experiencing is something that many organizations I'm working with want to address. And again, what are you going to do? Acknowledge it, but are there actions to back that up as well? Another one is making DEI only an HR priority. So we probably have a variety of folks here today on the call, some who are in HR, some who are, on the business side of things. Of course, HR is part of the business, but, it really takes leadership involvement and engagement to ensure that DEI priorities happen. Very often DEI requires leaders to change their behaviors, their point of view, their actions, hold others accountable. We see time and time again that companies that only have HR focused on this really are not making the kind of progress they should or could. And the last comment I just want to make is along the lines of relying on groups of underrepresented employees to lead your DEI strategy. There's kinds of two sides to this coin. In the past year, there's been a lot of outreach to underrepresented groups, particularly in the Black and African American communities and organizations in this country, to say, help us solve this. And there's kind of a fatigue from those individuals. We hear about it a lot, that they've been asked to be on DEI councils, give their feedback, go to a listening circle, attend a focus group, and that's great. Companies should be doing that, but there comes a point where it's the broader organization's responsibility to lead this change and not groups of underrepresented employees. There is a balance there. It's an important one to reach, and we are at a point where companies should really do some soul searching on where they're at to try to ensure that you are working towards achieving that balance. A very good example of that is sponsorship and leaders and in employee resource groups. That should really be a shared opportunity from a variety of stakeholders in your organization. All right, with that, I am going to turn things over to Bill to talk about another kind of area of priority and opportunity as you think about your DEI strategy. So Bill?
Thanks very much, Angela, I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about this important topic. So on all the slides Angela's been talking about before, we've raised a lot of issues and actions. Frankly, with so many issues to possibly address, it's a little bit hard to know where you might begin. And this is just one example of a particular task you can take on as a way of starting looking at your DEI support. And that is to conduct a careful assessment and an audit of your policies, practices, and your stated values. One way we will approach this sort of project is we just look simply at the documentation. We'll look at your employee handbook, look at your mission, vision, value statement, look at your code of conduct, and we'll also delve into materials such as your recruiting documentation. As you look at those documents, this slide covers a number of the key questions we look at. And if one of the first ones is whether your policies and practices truly support your DEI objectives by supporting employees who may have diverse needs. Do you respond to the diverse needs, different priorities of the different employees working for you? The next obvious question is, are the provisions inclusive? And remember, Angela spoke earlier about the range of dimensions of diversity. So as you look at the provisions in your practices, are you thinking about all the different dimensions of diversity and including people so that your employees feel like they're part of the team? Finally, or not finally, but among the major priority questions is, are you also appropriately citing and invoking DEI? You do want to emphasize the commitment, and you want to make sure that it's going deeply through the organization and is mentioned in your policies and practices. It is common when we find this sort of review, especially when we take a broad look at the documentation, that we'll find inconsistencies. Many times, that's not surprising given how broad the review is, and very often the inconsistencies may be minor, but there are cases where you need to be careful about consistency because even a minor inconsistency can be off-putting. For example, we've done studies of this kind where we look at some of the recruiting materials, and some of the documents say we don't discriminate on the basis of factors A, B, C, and D. Other documents still in the recruiting documentation only refer to factors A, B, and C. And if you've got a candidate who's in group D, they may suddenly question your commitment to true diversity. So again, because this is such a hot topic now, it's getting the attention it's deserved for a long time, it's really critical that you have these policies addressed to cover DEI. So Angela, if you could move to the next slide. So here, let's shift from the formal policies and practices to how you really make it work in your organization. And the key is getting the engagement from your employees, and particularly your leaders and managers. As we said on the prior slide, we want to make this a grassroots effort. So again, as Angela's example was, it's not just owned by HR. As Angela referred to earlier, we do a lot of research, and we are seeing some bright spots lately, particularly from senior leadership. This slide points out that board engagement with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts is now coming in at 51% in the US, and senior executive engagement is coming in at 75%. That is, the research tells us that these percentages of organizations say our board is involved in the DEI efforts, our senior executives are involved in this effort. And these are increases, and we're also seeing that senior executives are also doing more than just saying they're committed and making pledges. They are taking action, and the actions are being active participants. For example, leading the business resource groups that Angela was mentioning earlier, taking an active role in diversity councils, and of course, taking a more active role in personally mentoring diverse employees. If we look at the next slide, as much as this slide is showing good news, there's a gap and an opportunity when we look further down the organization. As we look at middle managers and frontline managers, the numbers are good and better than they have been in the past, but they're not where we want them to be. Only 54% of US companies report that their middle managers are involved in the DEI activities, and only 43% of frontline managers are involved. And middle and frontline managers, in our experience, are critical because that's really where the rubber meets the road. These are the managers who are having the day-to-day interactions with the employees, making the hiring and promotion decisions, and having the discussions with employees about topics like compensation. It's a truism of HR and of any business or any organization that your manager and your interactions with your manager make a much bigger difference in your satisfaction with your job and your development and career than the organizational policies. So that's why it's really important for us to get these managers involved. This is where we can move the needle. What we find is needed in our clients' organizations is to help train these managers to make sure that they can confidently lead the DEI agenda. And this can involve training such as helping them make better talent planning decisions. Have your managers been trained to avoid bias in assessing talent and when identifying candidates for development and promotions. A lot of data we've seen shows that bias is still affecting certain groups in this area. Another example would be, are your managers effective at supporting employees who need to go on a leave, both before the leave, during a leave, and after the leave when they're re-engaging with the group? Our research shows that managers who are trained to support their employees through the leave process actually have a better representation of women in leadership, because again, the women who may have been on leave are able to stay in the organization, stay engaged, and move through the ranks to become leaders. For the third item on the slide, here are the 57% of US organizations reporting that men are involved in DEI. A lot of our data here is based on some of our gender research globally, and this number is an increase from previous years, but if we look at 57% involved, that means we've got more than 40% of men in the organization are not involved in DEI, and this is clearly still too low. Because the men in the organization, in most organizations, still hold most of the leadership roles, it's really critical that they know how to support diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization, especially for gender-focused DEI efforts. The interesting, encouraging point is that research from some of our partners shows that the issue with this isn't that men don't want to help deliver the DEI agenda. The problem is they aren't sure what to do. So let's talk a little about what do you do? Angela, if you could look at the next slide. Oh, and we have a question, sorry, from John Kelly. Where does this data come from? Most of this, Angela, I know you know this better than I, but we've got research previously branded as the When Women Thrive research program, and it's also covered in Mercer's Global Talent Trends report. That was just recently released. Angela, do you have other comments about the data sources?
Yeah, just to say, so Mercer started doing our When Women Thrive global gender research in 2014, and our latest round of it, we completed the global data outreach in Q4 of 2019, right before COVID, and the results are from 1,200 organizations globally across many different industries, size of companies, et cetera. We published the report in March of 2020, which wasn't exactly the best timing for it, but that's where this data comes from. And some of the data that Bill referred to is from our 2021 global research related to our global talent trends. So this is, this is Mercer research. You know, and I saw a couple other questions. We could look at those too. I just want to add about, you know, to supplement before we move on around the question of getting men actively involved in DEI, getting white men actively involved in DEI. Many of the companies that I work with that are, you know, the large white male populations kind of predominantly, or, you know, just large male white populations, and particularly in leadership roles. One of the things that they discover, and I mentioned this, you know, because it's something you can anticipate, is that once DEI efforts begin in earnest, there's a lot of not just skepticism, but I have to be honest, in recent months, past 5-6 months or so, overt kind of challenges to the DEI agenda, questioning how it aligns with the business. And one of the recommendations I would make, and Bill's going to talk about one of the key things to do, but an additional action that I encourage my clients to take is have conversations openly to address the questions that are out there. Organizations who have not been doing DEI, who start to focus on it and talk about it, some of the feedback that we see and hear is that, well, I'm a white guy and I clearly have no future career path here, you know, so I don't have a future here. Or the other perennial favorite that we hear is, well, looks like we're going to have quotas and start hiring unqualified people. And, you know, obviously that is never the intent, to hire unqualified people, nor is it the intent that, you know, white men will never have a future career opportunity in companies that care about DEI. there's a whole host of sort of these assumptions that happen. And I always encourage my clients to be transparent and upfront, and, you know, to get all the different internal stakeholders engaged that are on the slide, have to, you know, have that be part of the conversation right up front. And a good way to do that is if you have a DEI council or you have employee or business resource groups, you know, have them spearhead those conversations and really lead the way in sharing the messages and getting the word out there, and trying to address it versus suppress it. And look, I don't mean to suggest that it's an easy thing to do, but it's a really imperative part of the change management process. Bill's going to talk about the next part that can be really a powerful tool in the change management process. But Bill, are there any questions that we want to take before we move on?
The question about the source of the data just questioned whether it applies for small businesses. And I think the best thing we could do is share the access to the reports, which are on mercer.com.
Yeah, it does. We had, and I can't forget what percentage of the 1,200, the data you're looking at here is the aggregate. We had a lot of smaller businesses participate in the research. And as I shared with Marcia and Yvette before our call started today, because, you know, we took a look at the list of participants today, and, you know, noted that there's a broad range of size of organizations on the webinar. You know, we have clients that, in fact, I would say probably, you know, 50% of our clients right now in the DEI space, in the US anyway, are smaller organizations under 1,000 employees. These are companies that really care about this and want to do something, but don't, you know, necessarily have the resources to do it. And the same kinds of hardwiring that we talk to, you know, giant jumbo companies about, we talk to small companies about. It gets deployed in a different way and maybe over a longer time frame. But, you know, in our view, the fundamentals are the fundamentals, and they can apply to smaller organizations. You know, they can scale to smaller organizations and still be really effective tactics. Bill, before we, since you've got the chat open, was there another question that we want to take?
Yes, we've got a question from Lawrence about whether the research uncovered any differences between success or failure among specific types of businesses, such as family-owned, private versus public, profit versus nonprofit. I'm not sure that, frankly, we might want to look more specifically at what the particular success question is. I assume you're talking about success at DEI efforts. Is that correct, Lawrence? Okay.
Yeah, well, we do, in our research, which as Bill said, we do have it online. You're welcome to take a look at it and see the benchmark information for the nonprofits. We did not get, and I think we have dimensions out there for privately owned. One of the things that I can tell you, since you mentioned family-owned businesses, and there may be a number of those here on the call, I'm actually working with 3 of them right now, 3 family-owned businesses, and they're pretty big actually. And you know, I would say this is sometimes true of other organizations that have a certain kind of profile. It can be challenging to get an organization to think about doing things differently. I mean, the reality with diversity, equity, inclusion is that probably something's going to need to change, that it can't be kind of business as usual, status quo. If you look across your organization and you're not diverse, and that's what your objective is to be, you kind of have to assume that something needs to be done differently. And sometimes that is aligned with owners, you know, family views, and sometimes it's not. I think what the aha very often is for organizations is that there's a broad range of things you can do to help drive diversity, equity, inclusion. A lot of companies get hung up, or leaders, over the language that's used. And sometimes it's just as simple as redefining what that company means about diversity, means by saying diversity, equity, inclusion. What does it actually look like for that organization? Once you get past the semantics of that, everybody's on board for kind of similar tactics. So there are some unique challenges there, but I think that those are, again, more of just getting all the stakeholders on the same page. And Bill's actually going to talk a little bit about that. And I'll just say that everybody talks about a DEI journey. In fact, we often start these webinars with a picture of a long journey. We didn't today, but it is a long journey. And to get started, you really do need to have alignment of your stakeholders, especially at the leadership level, board level, to make sure that everyone understands what the company means by diversity, equity, inclusion. And you'd be surprised how much that varies. And it's an important step. It takes a little bit of time, but it's worth doing.
Yep.
All right, Bill.
Culture change is hard. The first step is recognizing the characteristics of your own existing culture and deciding what it is you want to change about it.
Yeah.
So again, what does it look like when things are working better, when things are more effective? Sometimes it can be easier and more straightforward than you think. And I hope we're going to be showing you some positive action steps you can talk. But this was an interesting study. It's a cute headline from Quartz. In 2012, Google embarked on a project called Project Aristotle, studying hundreds of Google teams to figure out why some were more effective and others were not. And the headline from Quartz puts it in layman's term: the key to good teamwork is being nice. But if you look at the research findings more closely, what they're really saying is that the effective teams provide the members of the team with psychological safety. And when we talk about psychological safety, that basically means that everyone on the team feels like they're a part of the team and that their fellow teammates are not going to do anything to reject them or embarrass them or punish them for speaking up or having a different point of view. Basically, everyone's nice to each other. But the advantage of that, and what that means when you do have a diverse workforce, is that your diverse employees can be themselves. They can bring their whole selves to work. They can express their feelings candidly and confidently. And by bringing up those perspectives and different points of view, we can actually get the kind of innovation that all of our organizations are looking for. So then to turn now to, aside from being nice, doing a more proactive step, what can you do to create psychological safety? For those with power and influence, we can advance DEI by being allies. And as the slide says here, an ally is any person that actively promotes and aspires to advance the culture of inclusion through intentional, positive, and conscious efforts that benefit those around them. As an ally, what you're doing is you're using your power and influence to help others. And you do this through the entire employee life cycle, from identifying candidates to hiring, to onboarding the new employees, to looking at their development and career progression. You're working as an ally to use your influence and your power. And one of the things that we're seeing in this space more is that many of our clients are asking us to do more allyship training. This is really encouraging for us because it's much more engaging to train people on the positive actions they can take. And that's much more engaging than talking about things to avoid. DEI development is not just about don't do that. The key is to turn it around to do these things. So if we look at the next slide, it just shows a few examples of the things allies do. And I won't read through all of these. The deck will be available on the BCW website. But one of the first things is allies need to be committed to their own personal growth. We want to always be learning and asking questions and being open to different perspectives and points of view. And frankly, you need to really be aware that your experience and the way you see things and the attitudes you had growing up are not the only way of seeing the world. If you want to make people comfortable expressing different points of view, you need to be open to the fact that they may have come to your group with a different perspective. That, of course, means you need to listen and it's most important to accept people for who they are. And as we said, a key point of being an ally is being an advocate for your colleagues. Make sure that you help their work get the visibility and recognition it needs, which can, again, support their development and their contribution to the team. So Angela, I think I'm turning it over to you to have a summary slide. And we'll come back. There's one more, we've got one more slide, and then shall we come back to the latest question?
We can do the question right now.
So Lawrence has got, in terms of internal selling tools, can you discuss any insights into using data regarding changing customer bases, demographic shifts, as a way of selling the importance of broadening employee perspectives through DEI to better serve the business's needs? Basically, the organization should be as diverse as the customers we serve.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, in terms of, I think the very first part of that question, it's a great question, was using data to internally influence. Was that kind of the gist of that? Yeah. You know,
Sounds that way.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Lawrence, and important because, again, as I said earlier, when we engage with companies, we often see, as I said earlier, that not everybody, look, everybody, no one's against DEI, usually, sometimes, but usually it's not that anyone's against it. They just need to kind of understand, look, how does this fit into our business model? You know, even in a multi-stakeholder environment, AKA Larry Fink, we still need to, you know, have a business make money, be successful. So how does this fit in? So there are certain kinds of data that I do find that leadership teams, executives really respond to well. Earlier when we talked about the three-part equation to increasing diversity around, you know, hiring, promotion, and retention, I think a lot of leadership teams are kind of ignorant. And look, it's just because not every company looks at data this way, but they don't really understand or have visibility to the fact that, you know, yes, we're hiring people, but they're not staying and they're not getting promoted. Once you share that kind of workforce data with them, you know, leaders want successful companies and they want their employees to thrive. And once they kind of see the data through that lens, which usually reveals in most companies that there are opportunities to do better, they want to do better. They need to be able to focus on a specific kind of metric. You know, if you just say to an executive, we need to be more diverse. I mean, I'm sure some of you are on the call or C-suite, you're like, oh, great, but I need more than that. If you start to show them that breakdown of talent flows where slippage, leakage is happening with talent, so to speak, that's something that they can get on board with. So that's one really effective piece. The other item or kind of data point that I share with a lot of my clients, US based anyway, are the changing demographics of the US. As you saw from our slide that we shared earlier, the US is already very racially, ethnically diverse, and we are expected to, you know, just if you look at the projections on that, it just gets more so as one example. And so for companies that want to be relevant and successful in the future as a business, in terms of your employees and understanding your customer consumer base, you got to look at those changing demographics. I find that a lot of leaders that we work with don't really appreciate just how much more diverse the country is going to be in that respect. And you start to share that data with them, they take notice. The other piece is all the lots of data around, again, who's the workforce of the future, those younger employees. And they vote with their feet when it comes to their employers and who they want to work with. So if you want to have access to the best talent, you need to, you know, show up authentically and effectively around DEI. So those are some of the data points where I think it's kind of tough is for a lot of companies to say we want to look just like our consumers. And certainly my clients that are consumer products, it's critical that they have representation from those demographics on their teams. They've told me like just really crazy, shocking stories about bad things that happen when it doesn't. Some of you may have experienced that. Is it necessary for your workforce to look exactly like that? You know, I mean, it takes a lot of time to dramatically change the composition of your workforce. And maybe that's something that you are going to strive for over time. But in the shorter term, I think what's critical is ensuring that, you're working toward it, and then you've got representation from the right demographic. So I think there's a variety of data that you can bring in. And also just one last comment, that's the external labor market. You all are operating in Westchester County. I mean, you obviously have access to a broad metropolitan pool of talent, but there's who's going to commute, what's that going to look like, can they afford to live in Westchester County, all these kinds of considerations to really understand not just who your customer is, but what your available talent pool. The last thing I'll say in this is that I have clients who are taking advantage of work from home. And I work with one client out of Chicago who hired their first chief diversity officer out of Washington, DC. That individual will never work in the corporate office. She will always be in Washington, DC, which is her home. And so the new flexibility around work can open up some new talent markets for you that you may not have had access to for certain roles. And I think that's another interesting point to talk to your leaders about. So I know that was a lot, but there are a lot of different data points that can be used to kind of, I don't like to say there's a business case for DEI. Companies should do the right thing when it comes to human beings, having jobs, being productive and thriving. But, the reality is there's still many companies that need to create that business case, plenty of data points out there around it to help convince leadership teams like, this isn't the flavor of the day. We need a strategy. We need to take action. Bill, any other questions before we move on?
Nope, not at this point.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just move us on then to kind of a summary of how you can accelerate your progress or even how you can get started on your journey. I talked to a lot of different companies around the US and different kinds of roundtables and things like that. And I find that sometimes, or when I talk to a new client, they're very reluctant to admit that they're just starting their journey. Well, the reality is lots of companies are just starting their journey. It's, it is what it is. And you're starting. That's the important point. You're getting on the road. So, that's the good part of it. You don't need to be reluctant to sort of talk about that. It's challenging. Based on the research that, like I said, that we've been doing, we started our global gender research in 2014, but Mercer's been looking at data and analytics in this space for 30 years, depending on which of our leaders in that group you talk to. And we know that there's really three components to think about, and that the companies that we see that make the most progress in this space are activating in different ways on all three of them. The first one is that individual piece that we've talked a lot about today. Got to have those leaders on board, got to have, frontline managers, that level, everybody engaged, trained, ready to go, being allies and set up. That individual piece is what ultimately drives the inclusion. That's such a foundation for everything else that follows. And that part's critical, but alone, it doesn't really sustain the progress. For that, you've got to get that hardwiring, which is the organizational piece, finding proof and evidence of what's happening. Just going back to our recruiting example, there's always the immediate, like, we just need to recruit more. Well, that probably is true, but at the same time, you also need to do other stuff. So have proof of what needs to be addressed, prioritize it and fix it, and then get the right processes and programs in place. DEI doesn't fix itself. It's like any other business challenge or issue. You gotta do stuff to fix it. And the last thing I'll say is just the opportunity around, we call it societal. That's kind of a big term for it, but it's really about, partnering with your community externally, partnerships, other kinds of things that you can do to really connect more externally with your community and tap into diversity in ways that you may not have had access to otherwise. So it's really, again, companies that we see that are making progress, their strategies around DEI have pieces in each of these different categories. So Bill, I saw we had another question pop up. I think we have 5 minutes left, so we can take a few more questions.
I actually think we're just getting a reminder to wrap up, but yes, we're open to questions from anybody. So please put your question in chat.
Well, we'd love to hear, I've got a couple of minutes if there's any kinds of innovative or really effective program that any of you have implemented around DEI. Feel free to chat that as well. I think we got a couple comments here. Bill, is there anything that just came up?
Nothing. Just a thank you from the team. So we're glad this was helpful. If there's anything else, please follow up. And regarding the research, we'll see about getting a direct link, but you can definitely find the Global Talent Trends reports on mercer.com, mercer.com.
Great, thank you. And it's been our pleasure today. So thank you very much. Marcia, we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Bill and Angela. I have sat transfixed listening to you the whole time because I think that you provided us very, very concrete examples of an approach that all sectors and all sizes of businesses can do and can begin to think about and can begin to implement. And so we appreciate your expertise, your knowledge, your very practical approach and advice. Your honest approach. I think that you said things that were very, very honest. Being an ally, I love that. I love that. Talking about psychological safety, the changing demographics. That's all something that our members and our listeners today have really absorbed. And I know we're going to talk about it. And we love having Mercer as a resource to us and as a partner, not only to the Business Council of Westchester, but to the entire country and certainly our region. You did a great job. We thank everybody for joining us today, and we look forward to future discussions.
Thank you.
And I know this will live in our resource center as well. So if anyone is interested in watching it, it's also on Facebook, and you have your slides. So there's a lot here. There's a lot here to absorb. Thank you all. Have a great day. Stay safe. Still wear a mask. Still be careful and be healthy. Enjoy.
Thanks very much, everybody.